the U.S. is now warning Moscow against using chemical or biological weapons. President Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, warned his Russian counterpart on Wednesday, according to the New York Times, against, quote, any possible Russian decision to use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine. The explicit warning to Nikolai Patrushev, President Putin's main national security advisor, reflected escalating concerns in Washington that the Russians, stymied in their hopes of a quick takeover of the country, could resort to weapons of mass destruction. Officials said there was no direct mention of the use of battlefield nuclear weapons, though two officials said the administration did send a separate warning on that issue. And this does raise the question, okay, if Russia goes ahead and they feel so boxed in that they use chemical or biological weapons, or, God forbid, a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield, what exactly does the West do at this point? Remember, it was Barack Obama who drew a red line against using chemical weapons in Syria, only to back off wildly from that red line as soon as Assad used chlorine gas in Syria, and he just handed over the entire place to the Russians. So if you're Vladimir Putin, you feel totally boxed in. Do you just go for broke here? I mean, you already went into Ukraine. You've already lost thousands of troops, more than the entire Western losses during the Afghanistan-Iraq war, probably. So what do you do? Okay, so let's take that for example. Let's say that, for example, Vladimir Putin does go for it. Let's say that he uses chemical or biological weapons. Is the West willing to get directly involved here? So there have been recommendations that what the West actually should do here is station troops in Western Ukraine. They should sort of edge over the border. Western Ukraine has not been taken over by the Russians. There's been really no Russian activity in the western part of Ukraine. The furthest west they've gone is Kyiv, which is about, 2/3 of the way west of the eastern border of Ukraine. But they've not really done anything in the western third of Ukraine. So if you station NATO troops there, then you basically say to Putin, listen, if you cross this particular line, you're going to start killing NATO troops. And at that point, we have to get directly involved. The problem with setting a red line with regard to chemical or biological weapons is that if Putin uses them, are you willing to go to full-scale boots on the ground war with Vladimir Putin over his use of chemical or even tactical battlefield nuclear weapons? If Vladimir Putin decides he's just going to level population centers, what exactly are you going to do about it? This is the real question for the West right now. Because as that box tightens in around Vladimir Putin, and as Zelensky feels that he might be able to win this thing outright because too many Russian troops are getting killed, what happens if Putin just decides to go for it? This is what Brett Stevens over at the New York Times is writing about today. He says, before the invasion, we had the Russian invasions of Georgia, Crimea, and eastern Ukraine, the Russian carpet bombing of Aleppo, the use of exotic radioactive and chemical agents against Russian dissidents on British soil, Russian interference in U.S. elections, the murder of Boris Nemtsov, the blatant poisoning and imprisonment of Alexei Navalny. Were any of these sovereignty violations, legal violations, treaty violations, war crimes, and crimes against humanity met with a strong, united, punitive response that could have averted the next round of outrages? Did Western responses to other violations of global norms, Syria's use of chemical weapons against civilians, Beijing's eradication of Hong Kong's autonomy, Iran's war by proxy against its neighbors, give Vladimir Putin pause? In short, did Putin have any reason to think before February 24th he wouldn't be able to get away with this invasion? He did not. The West has spent 22 years placating Putin through a long cycle of resets and wrist slaps. The devastation of Ukraine is the fruit of this appeasement. The Biden administration now faces the question of whether it wants to bring this cycle to an end, and the answer is not clear. Sanctions have hurt the Russian economy. Arms shipments to Ukraine have helped slow the Russian advance. Russia's brutality has unified NATO. This is to Biden's credit, but the administration continues to operate under a series of potentially catastrophic illusions. Sanctions may devastate Russia in the short term, but the immediate struggle in Ukraine is short term. It is not long term. So if the sanctions hurt Russia long term, short term doesn't matter all that much. For Russia, what do they care? Their economy's bad for 3 years, but if they get what they want in Ukraine, that's happening over the next 6 weeks. Arming Ukraine with Javelin and Stinger missiles has wounded and embarrassed the Russian military. Providing Kyiv with MiG-29 fighter jets and other potentially game-changing weapon systems could help turn the tide. Refusing to do so may only prolong Ukraine's agony. Frequent suggestions Putin has already lost the war or that he can't possibly win when Ukrainians are united in their hatred for him, or that he's looking for an off-ramp, may turn out to be right, but they are grossly premature, says Brett Stevens. This war is only in its third week. It took the Nazis longer to conquer Poland. The ability to subdue a restive population is chiefly a function of the pain an occupier is willing to inflict. And Putin has no limits on that one. There is now a serious risk these illusions could collapse very suddenly. There's little evidence so far Putin is eager to cut his losses. On the contrary, to do so now would jeopardize his grip on power. So expect him to double down. If he uses a chemical weapon or deploys a battlefield nuclear weapon in keeping with long-standing Russian military doctrine, does he lose more than he gains? The question answers itself. He wins swiftly, he terrifies the West, he consolidates power. He suffers consequences only marginally graver than the ones already inflicted, and his fellow travelers in Beijing, Tehran, and Pyongyang take note. So I tend to agree with Brett Stevens here. The fact that our deterrence failed with regard to Ukraine means that trying to reestablish deterrence in Ukraine is going to, it's the same thing as the economy. It's going to cause pain. The question is when you want to take the pain. So is the pain going to be in watching Putin devastate Ukraine? Is public opinion going to be willing to go along with that to avert an open war between NATO and Russia? Because Putin is probably going to up the ante here. Or alternatively, is the West basically going to look the other way while Putin subjects the Ukrainians to the kind of treatment that the Chechens got in Grozny or that the Syrians got in Aleppo? And if that happens, how do you reestablish deterrence after that? Because every time you fail in deterrence, you now have to react more harshly in order to reestablish the possibility of deterrence. If you let the bully beat up everybody on the playground, you're going to need to stand up to him pretty damn strong if you want him to stop doing that at some point here. So the possibility of World War III is becoming significantly more likely, not less likely, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And now it's not clear whether it becomes even more likely or less likely should the NATO forces start to engage in actual containment mechanisms against Vladimir Putin at this point. Meanwhile, if you're Vladimir Zelensky, you're just looking for help because obviously the short-term problem is your problem. You're not worried about the ramifications of World War III. The West is. You're worried about the ramifications of bombs falling on theaters in the middle of Mariupol right now. So Zelensky spoke in front of the U.S. Congress yesterday. He did about half the speech in Ukrainian. He did half the speech in English. He started by talking about Pearl Harbor and 9/11. And by the way, one thing that should become very clear from all of this is how lucky you are and I am and everybody is to live in the United States. We have lived in a country where bombs do not fall on us on the regular. We have lived in a country that has never had to experience this in our history. Okay, the worst things that we've seen in our lifetime are 9/11, which was a horrific terrorist attack, but it was not a regular weeks-long bombing campaign against civilian centers in the United States. It was a really horrifyingly evil terrorist day. But what you see in other countries on a fairly regular basis is just violence that pervades life. Here's Zelensky talking about how bad it is in Ukraine.
Remember Pearl Harbor, terrible morning of December 7, 1941, when your sky was black from the planes attacking you. Just remember it. Remember September the 11th, a terrible day in 2001 when evil tried to turn your cities, independent territories, in battlefields, when innocent people were attacked.
Yeah, he continued along these lines. He tried to make a direct argument to Joe Biden. He's trying to get Joe Biden to take the leadership position that Joe Biden really does not want. He says, you need to be the leader of the world, be the leader of peace.
Today, it's not enough to be the leader of the nation. Today, it takes to be the leader of the world. Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace. Peace in your country doesn't depend anymore only on you and your people. It depends on those next to you, on those who are strong.
You can't blame Zelensky for making this moral appeal. After all, his country is under threat of essentially being overthrown by the Russian bear. Zelensky continued along these lines. He talked about the virtue of strength in the face of Russian aggression.
Strong doesn't mean big. Strong is brave and ready to fight for the life of his citizens and citizens of the world. For human rights, for freedom, for the right to live decently and to die when your time comes, and not when it's wanted by someone else, by your neighbor.
So Zelensky essentially saying, I'm willing to die for my country. Sentiments you don't hear too often in the United States, where literally 5 in 10 Democrats say that they would flee rather than fighting for their country, as opposed to 4 who would stay. Zelensky completed his speech by showing a video of the suffering that's been going on in Ukraine. Very, very difficult to watch. It's graphic content, but so is war. So here is what Zelensky showed yesterday to the U.S. Congress. So it shows what these cities looked like before, and now it shows what the cities look like now. Just devastated. It says, close the sky over Ukraine is how this completes. And this was his call. Close the sky, close the sky. The idea being calling for a no-fly zone. NATO has rightly been hesitant to declare a no-fly zone because they don't want to go to direct war with Russia. And again, the question is going to be, what does Russia do in order to secure Ukraine that could provoke a war? And is the West willing to do anything? Or is the West going to draw its next line at somewhere beyond Ukraine?